Originally from Alaska, our first guest is a writer and former member of the 2000 National Poetry Slam champion team, NYC Urbana, featured in the New York Times and on NPR's Infinite Mind, as well as at the South by Southwest Music Festival in Austin, Texas. As a performance poet, she has toured internationally and was selected to be part of an all-woman tour, including introducing slam poetry to Denmark. She now lives in Chicago and is focused primarily on fiction, most recently completing the first draft of her novel, Vigil, at Ragdale. She's very excited to be reading at Tuesday Funk again, so please welcome back Noel Jones.
Hello. So nice to see everybody. I want to thank Hopleaf and Mark, the most generous bartender ever. Please be generous with him. And Andrew and Eden for having me back. And this is a short story that I actually just finished called Oblivion for now. In haste to catch her bus, Carmen ducked out the doors of the theater and leaned into the wind, pulling the flaps of her open coat across her body. Red light. She dashed through the slush across 4 empty lanes of Michigan Avenue to the express stop on the other side. There she encountered a pod of Midwesterners shifting slowly on the curb in their puffy winter gear, oblivious to other people whose paths they were obstructing. Carmen recalled the annual Urban Dictionary contest inviting readers to coin new words and terms each year. Neanderthal was her favorite. She had thought Neanderthals often since moving to Chicago. There was a rhythmic challenge to fitting in that she had not yet mastered, and she never anticipated the move would entail such a culture shock. Chicago and New York were, after all, both large, cosmopolitan cities. Both were famous for their museums and their mafias, their comedy and their journalism, the brutality of their humid summers and frigid winters. Yet there was a difference, one less apparent than the obvious comparison of a Chicagoan's friendly demeanor to the clipped guard of the average Manhattanite. It crept up on Carmen like the punchline of a joke that she didn't get until everyone else had laughed. It was the slow registering of an almost universal reaction to her manner. A subtle recoiling akin to a mother backing a stroller away from a drunken stranger in a public place. Chicago was a constant surprise of doors opening easily and closing suddenly, triggered by delicate sensors she could not see. Having left everything behind to be with Seth, she longed to make friends of her own. She shed her blacks for pastels and earth tones, lowered her voice, and did her best to refrain from cursing and speaking in definitive statements. But it was no use. Everywhere she went in this delicate city, it seemed that the simple statement of opinion or tone of certainty was like a giant fart that caused those nearby to twitch and drift away. When a seat opened near her on the L train, she sat in it, only to observe the passive exchange of disapproving looks between other passengers. After the matinee that day, she had attempted to hurry through the crowded lobby of attendees blinking their way into the light, only to reach 2 sets of double doors where she engaged in the awkward dance of courtesy that she encountered frequently. Men in front of her insisting on holding the doors open for her first, even though the flow of foot traffic clearly dictated that the smoothest operation for all involved would be to simply walk through the door. Carmen pivoted her way around each ill-placed body at the bus stop, ignoring the wounded glances of those waiting patiently. At times like these, she missed New York, its brisk pace of millions in constant circulation, and the brusque manner of its residents. Carmen found her sense of efficiency affronted on a daily basis by the polite, patient pace of the heartland. It slowed her down. A freckle-faced woman in a knit cap and cat-eye glasses recoiled, alarmed at the rudeness of someone who refused to be content to hover outside a covered bus stop in January when it was only half full. The wind surged, and Carmen sidestepped to get around the woman, only to find that a young Cubs fan in noise cancellation headphones now obstructed her path. She glanced at her feet to measure whether or not to step off the sidewalk to get around, and decided instead to tiptoe along the edge of the curb, working her shoulders back and forth like a rudder so as to narrow the width of her torso as she slipped by. A rush of air took her by surprise. pushed by a passing bus that narrowly missed clipping her. The long, articulated vehicle seemed to appear out of nowhere, out of silence. It squealed and sighed to a stop, its tires spraying the curb and the boots of anyone standing too close. She shivered at the thought of just how far the bus would have thrown her body. To the next intersection, she was certain. She imagined the thud, the skid, the screaming, and shivered. Then she shook it off and stepped onto the bus, tapping the toes of her boots as she got on to knock off the slush. Thankfully, the freckled woman in the Cubs fan did not get on behind her. She wanted to curse at them. It was their fault she was so close to the curb in the first place. Why were New Yorkers considered the rude ones? Far ruder, Carmen thought, to feel entitled to obstruct the urgent path of others in a hurry, a universal faux pas in New York. Carmen sighed and resigned her body to the curvature of her seat as the adrenaline began to subside. The truth was, she loved the relaxed pace of her new city. She could let herself go a little, sport a sloppy bun tied against the constant wind. She could get lost and change directions without being bumped and cursed at by passers-by. Her cell phone vibrated in her coat pocket, and she pulled it out onto her lap, smiling to see Seth's name on the screen. Headed to the cafe to do a little writing. Where are you? On the express, home soon. We can go together. Carmen gazed out through the window to watch Lake Michigan float by. Only in winter was she convinced that the lake was not an ocean. In summer, it stretched out from its sandy beaches, glimmering in all directions with no sign of land in the distance, a steady succession of small waves created by boat wakes and wind lapping constantly at the shore. But in winter months, from her office high in the Hancock building, she watched the ice form into a gray mass that grew farther out over the water each week like a giant scab. In early winter, when the wind was high, the waves had heaved and layered themselves in thick slabs along the shoreline that now jutted up like compound fractures shimmering in the sun. The traffic was smooth, the bus gliding along Lakeshore Drive unhindered. Carmen watched as the bus passed a woman walking her golden retriever on the path, then a man jogging cautiously on the ice, puffs of white breath trailing from his lips. Next was an intrepid cyclist with a black face mask beneath his helmet, back hunched, head down into the wind. He appeared to keep pace with the bus for a moment before falling away. Home soon. She closed her eyes and leaned her head against the window. For all her griping about Chicago, she was happy as long as she had Seth. They had met as musicians on a cruise ship gig during what seemed like another life. Upon discovering that they were both closet writers, they began reading their stories to each other during breaks after work. One night at the bar, when all the old folks had drifted back to their cabins, he pressed his mouth against hers in a way that caused her to feel completely unmoored, which is how he eventually succeeded in the impossible, convincing a New Yorker to move to another American city. He recited the high square footage and low rent of his apartment between kisses he planted along her neck, one clear-cut advantage of life in Chicago that any New Yorker can understand. And I, Kiss, will drive, Kiss, the U-Haul. Carmen swooned. Her friends were still in denial on that hot day in August when the truck pulled away from the curb of her studio apartment in Spanish Harlem. I don't get it. Why doesn't he move here? Her dreadlocked bandmate was gripping the handle of her clarinet case as if he might hold it ransom. I mean, what's out there, really? Carmen countered with the same rent and square footage that had seduced her in the first place and took the clarinet case before kissing him on both cheeks. And we'll have a guest room. You could come visit, added Carmen. But they both looked at each other sadly, knowing it would never happen. Seth started the engine. The abuelitas next door sat fanning themselves in their lawn chairs on the sidewalk, looking on attentively as if watching a novella. Carmen extended a pale arm out the open passenger window, waving side to side like Miss America to lighten the mood. She looked at her phone again. 3:31. Earlier than she thought. In fact, she had thought that was about the time she left the theater. She had always been a daydreamer. Time management was never her strong suit. Good that it was early. The sun would be up for a little while, and she and Seth could walk around the neighborhood before going to the cafe, something they both liked doing, even in cold weather. When she arrived at her stop, she cursed herself for forgetting her gloves and stuffed her hands in her pockets until she turned onto their street. Pulling her stiff hands out, she willed her fingers to tap out a text. "I'm down the block. Forgot my gloves." Seth stood burrowing the lower half of his face into the scarf Carmen had knitted him as he knocked his boots back and forth against each other in front of their yellow brick apartment building. Carmen strode up the sidewalk and stood on her tiptoes to kiss him, marveling at the difference in temperature between their mouths and the frigid air. She slipped her arm through his. Seth kissed the top of her head and handed her gloves to her. "Want to go to the cemetery?" "It's too late, isn't it?" "They don't close until dark, and it'll be light for a while." "Hey, where are you off to so fast?" "We don't have much time." "Relax, slow down." They liked walking in the cemetery together. Last time they had seen a brown hawk swoop down from a tree to alight on the point of an obelisk, surveying the ground intently. They had held their breath as it dove down to grab a squirrel in its talons and rise back into the air, its prey writhing in its grip. The couple strolled through the graveyard, chatting about Seth's guitar students and the matinee Carmen had seen, Death and the Maiden, as well as her narrow brush with the bus. But they saw no hawks, no squirrels, no life at all beyond the soft stirring and clicking of bare branches in the wind. When they arrived at the cafe, they both got mochas without whipped cream and took a booth in the back where they pulled out their laptops and sipped at the foam, cupping their cold fingers around the hot porcelain cups. "Ready?" "Ready." Seth winked and they opened their laptops at the same time. They had a rule on their writing dates, no talking until it was time to go. Carmen cherished these times when they came to the cafe together, each silently delving into a world of his own devising. "Alone together," Seth liked to say. "That's what we all are anyway when you think about it," he said later at the apartment as they curled their bodies together under their bedspread to warm up after the walk home. Seth pressed Carmen's stiff hands against his belly to warm them. "Your fingers are as cold as tree branches." It was only in the periphery of her mind that Carmen had registered that twilight had only just begun as they had walked home, but now in the gray blue light of the bedroom she noticed. She turned her head to look out the window, where she could still make out the dark shape of the neighbor's roof pitched against the dim sky. The wind stirred the branches of the trees outside for a moment, then they settled back into place. "Shouldn't it be dark by now?" "Shh." Carmen felt a twinge in her neck. "My neck," she said. A flare shot through her skull and down her spine. "My head, my back." "Shh." Seth's mouth moved, but she couldn't make out the words over the wailing of a siren outside, the horn so loud it must have been parked on their street. A woman was screaming. There were several voices growing louder until they seemed to be right there in the room, cross-talking frantically. Seth's eyes drooped, his mouth melting open as he drifted off to sleep, still pressing her hands to his belly. Her hands. She couldn't feel her hands, her feet, her legs. "She just stepped out in front of me." The man's voice behind her was frantic. Carmen tried to turn her neck on the pillow, but pain bolted through her head. She couldn't move. "Seth." She was trying to get to the front of the line. "Everybody move away, please. Give us room." Carmen's gaze drifted up as she watched the ceiling of their bedroom dissolve into the passing clouds overhead. "She ran from across the street. I saw her. She was running."